everyone, welcome to another video. This time I want to show you how to deploy images from a private container registry into your Kubernetes cluster. So the plan for today is, first we're going to talk what is a private container registry, why would you want to use one. Then I'm going to show you how to set up a private Kubernetes cluster and an Azure Container Registry. And then we're going to configure the Kubernetes cluster to access the container registry over a private connection. Now let's have a look what the private Azure Container Registry actually is. Before this, let's have a look at a public Azure Container Registry, because if you deploy a container registry, by default, it's available over the internet. This means you as a developer, but also your deployment agent or an attacker can gain access to the container registry over the internet. So the worst case scenario would be an attacker gains access and they upload a compromised image to your container registry, and then your Kubernetes cluster pulls this image and runs it inside the cluster, which could give the attacker access to your Kubernetes cluster. Using this approach also means if you have a Kubernetes cluster, that is Kubernetes cluster pulls the images over the internet. Even if both the container registry and the AKS cluster are running inside the same location in Azure, it's always pulled over the internet. This is a reason why we want to have a private Azure Container Registry. So in this case, we don't allow any internet-facing connections. This means that developers don't have access, but also attackers don't gain any access. And the connections is only possible from within a VNet. This could be the same VNet, or this could be a peered VNet. I'm going to show you later what this means. But for now, the way this works is we create a private endpoint for Azure Container Registry. And this private endpoint can be attached to a VNet. This could be either the VNet of the AKS cluster or a separate VNet. And this private endpoint also creates a private DNS zone. And with this DNS zone, we can pull the image over the private connection from the Azure Container Registry. This means our Kubernetes cluster doesn't have to access the internet to pull the images. And in my last video, I showed you how to create a private AKS cluster. This means the AKS cluster is not available from the internet. And with this approach, also your container registry is not available from the internet. And this allows you to have all the resources only privately accessible and therefore keep them secure. One downside of this approach is that also your deployment pipeline doesn't have access to your container registry. So like in the last video, you have to have an agent running inside the same VNet, and then the agent can deploy images to the container registry. Let me know if you're interested. I can make a video and show you how to set up this agent and have a full end-to-end solution built from deploying the image to the container registry and then pulling it in the Kubernetes cluster. But for now, let's take a look how this works. First, I'm going to show you how it works in theory, and next I'm going to show you a practical example. To use a private Azure Container Registry, we have to use the premium tier of the container registry, because only with the premium tier we can disable the public network access. It's a bit annoying because it's more expensive, but I think a container registry costs around $50 a month, the premium tier, so it's not too expensive. And once we have this, we have two options. Either we create the private endpoint in the same VNet as our Kubernetes cluster, or we use a different VNet. So let's first take a look at creating the private endpoint in the AKS VNet. So we create the private endpoint and attach it to the AKS VNet. Creating the private endpoint automatically also creates a private DNS zone and configures the DNS zone with the private endpoint. And that's already everything we have to do. Next, our AKS cluster can pull the image, but the AKS cluster has to use the public URL. So that's the same URL you would use as if you have a public container registry. And when you pull the image with the public URL, the private DNS resolves this public URL to the private IP address and redirects the request to the private endpoint. And this allows you to pull the image from within the VNet. Now let's have a look what we have to do if we want to have the private endpoint. So obviously the first step would be to create the VNet, but once we have this, we again create the private endpoint and attach it to the new VNet. And this also creates a private DNS zone and automatically configures the DNS zone. But now we have to add a VNet peering between our new VNet and the AKS VNet. This is basically a connection between the two VNets so they can communicate with each other. By default, everything that's inside the VNet can communicate with each other, but if it's outside the VNet, then they can't communicate. And after we have configured the VNet peering, then we also have to add the AKS VNet to our private DNS zone. And this configures the VNet to use our private DNS and resolve the requests. And this allows the AKS VNet to access our private endpoint in the different VNet. And after we've set this up, we can again use the public URL to pull the images, and the private DNS resolves the request to the private endpoint. And now let's take a look how all of this can be set up. Before we get started, let's define a couple variables. So we define the name of our AKS cluster, the name of the resource group, a location, then the name of our Azure Container Registry, and the name of a repository token. And we're going to use this token later to pull the images from the container registry. What is important if you try the demo yourself, that the name for the Azure Container Registry has to be unique worldwide. So you have to change this name. And as always, all the code will be available on GitHub, and the link is in the description. And with this setup, we can create a resource group. So we just provide the name of the resource group and the location. And now we can create the AKS cluster. And what's interesting here is that we use this enable private cluster feature. And this makes the cluster private. This means the management API is not accessible from the internet. If you're interested in more details, I will link you the video to the last week where I explain exactly what a private cluster is and how to set it up. But for now, let's deploy the cluster, and I will be back once the deployment is finished. The Kubernetes cluster has been deployed, and now we can download the config. So just use AKS get credentials and download the kubeconfig. And now we can deploy our container registry. So we use the ACR create command. We provide the same resource group name. Then we provide the name for the container registry, and we use the premium tier. And now with the container registry deployed, I'm also going to import an image, which I'm going to use to test the connection. So I'm going to use the ACR import command. Then I provide the name to the container registry and what image I want to import. So in this case, I want to import the Nginx image. With this, we are finished with our setup. Usually I would configure everything in the command line, but I think it's easier if I do it in the portal because it's easier for you to follow if you have never seen it. So let's switch to the Azure portal and let's refresh this page, and there we can see our container registry. And by now it's just a public container registry with one repository inside. And what I'm going to do now is I disable this public access. Then I create a repository token, and then we are going to deploy a test application in our Kubernetes cluster and see what happens. So the first thing we want to do is go to the networking tab. and then we disable public network access. And we're also going to disable this firewall exception, which says allow trusted Microsoft services to access this container registry. Because I want to have full control over what applications are allowed to access my container registry, so I'm going to disable everything and only allow what I want. And the next thing is to create a repository token. And with this repository token, our Kubernetes cluster can access the container registry. This is the recommended way how to give out permissions, because you can scope the permissions on a repository level, but you can also set granular permissions. For example, you can say one token is only able to read images, whereas another token can also delete or write them. So to create a new token, we go to tokens under the repository permission, and then we click on add. Then we provide a name, and this is going to be the same name as I've provided before in the ACR token name variable. And then we can set a scope. So these are already predefined scopes, for example, to pull or push. But you could also create your own scope if you want even more granular permissions. But for now, pulling is enough. And then we create this token. And as you can see here, we have passwords, but they have not been created yet. And to create one, we click on the token, and then we can regenerate the password. We could set an expiry date, which is a good idea for production workloads, but for now we don't need this, so we just create a password, and then we copy this password. With this copied password, we can switch back to our terminal. Now we're going to deploy the image we have in our container registry, and then we see what happens. And since we have a private cluster, we can't use the Azure CLI or the kubectl to access the cluster directly. We have to use the Azure CLI to wrap our command. And if you're interested in this, I will link the video, my last video, where you learn all the details how to access and how to use a private cluster. But for now, what we're going to do is we provide the resource group name and the cluster name, and then inside this command section, we provide our kubectl command. So in this case, we create a new namespace called ACR. Since it's a private cluster, it's taking a couple seconds to execute the command. Next, we are going to create a secret inside this new namespace. And this secret will be used to pull the image from our container registry. So we provide the Docker server, that's the public URL of our Azure Container Registry. Then the Docker username is the name of the token we provided before. And the Docker password is the password we just copied from the token. So let's create this. And now I'm going to deploy a pod, and this pod is going to use this token. So let's have a look at the configuration of this pod. So it's just a simple pod where we use the public URL of the container registry, and we use the nginx repository. And as image pull secret, we are providing the name of this Kubernetes secret we just created. So in this case, it's token secret. And if you go back to the terminal, we can see here that the name is also token secret. Now let's apply this file. And when you have a private cluster, you have to provide the file in the kubectl command, but then you also have to provide the file with the file parameter. And the pod has been deployed, and now let's wait a couple seconds for the pod to get started, and then we check what the status of the pod is and what is going on in our cluster. And to do this, we just do a normal kubectl get pod with the name of the pod we just created. And now we can see we have an error. We have an error image pull. This means something didn't work when the Kubernetes cluster tried to pull the image. And now we can do a kubectl describe pod, and then we can see what's going on with this pod. And there we will see that our Kubernetes cluster is not allowed to access the container registry. And the error messages are not always the best, but here we can see failed to pull our image, and it says 403 forbidden. This means that our Kubernetes cluster is not allowed to pull from our container registry. And this makes sense because we disabled the public access and we haven't configured a private access. So now let's configure the private access, and then let's try again how to deploy our application. Here again, usually I would do it in the command line, but I think it is easier for you to follow if I do it in the Azure portal. So let's switch back to the portal, to our container registry, and we go back again to the networking tab. And on top, we have here private access. And there we already have the option to create a private endpoint connection. So we click on this. Then we provide a name, or the subscription, the resource group. Then we provide a name. So ACR PE for private endpoint. Then the region, I use the same region as for the other resources. For me, that's Canada Central. Then it's automatically selecting the container registry. So this is our name here. And it also selects that the resource type is a registry. Then with the virtual network, we can either use the AKS VNet or we can use a different one. But since we only have the AKS VNet, it selected this one already. And for now, I leave it as it is. Then you could configure application security groups. So if you want to control who is allowed to talk to whom inside your VNet. But for now, we leave it as it is. Then the private DNS. So once we create our private endpoint, Azure automatically creates a private DNS zone with the name privatelink.azure.cr.io. And here we can configure in what subscription and in what resource group we want to have this DNS. So again, we leave it as it is. And then we don't provide any tags, and we're going to create our private endpoint. And this deployment is now creating the private endpoint, attaches it to our AKS VNet, then creates a private DNS zone and also adds the VNet to the DNS zone. This is going to take a couple minutes, and I'll be back once the deployment is finished. The deployment is finished, and now we can take a look at our private endpoint. So if we scroll down on the left side, there you can see nothing special going on, but the most interesting part is probably the DNS configuration. So we can see here the private DNS name, and we can see down here the private DNS zone. And everything has been set up for us, so we didn't have to configure anything. And if you take a look at the private DNS zone, there we can also see that the records have been created. And if we click on the left to virtual network links, we can see here that our AKS VNet has been added. And if we had created our private endpoint in a different VNet, then this VNet would have been added here. And then we would have additionally had to add the AKS VNet. So you just click on add, and then you select the AKS VNet. So now we've set up the private endpoint, We've configured everything, and now it should be able for our Kubernetes cluster to pull the image from the private container registry. To see if this is true, let's go back to the terminal and try it. So let's clean up the window. And first I'm going to delete the old pod we had. And if you try out the demo the same way as I presented here, you might get an error message because there's a lot of caching going on. So it's recommended to wait a couple minutes before you deploy the next pod. But I hope it's working. So I'm going to deploy the same pod we've deployed before with the same command. So it's just a kubectl apply. And I don't have to change anything because with the private endpoint in place, the private DNS zone will resolve our request to the private endpoint. So I can still use the public URL of our container registry. And after the pod has been deployed, I'm going to wait a couple seconds again, and then I'm checking if the pod is running this time or if you get the same error message as before. So let's see if it's running or not. And there we can see we have an error. So it's the same error as before, I bet. So let's describe the pod, and you should see the error 403 forbidden again. Exactly, here it is. This is happening because there's a lot of caching going on. It takes a couple minutes for the DNS to propagate. So the best thing would be to wait a couple minutes and then try it again. To make sure I don't have any problems, I'm going to clean up the namespace. I'm going to create the secret again, and I will be back before I deploy the pod. I've waited around half an hour, and I also deleted the namespace, recreated it, and also created the secret to access the container registry again. And now let's try to deploy our pod, and this time it hopefully works. The pod has been deployed, and now it's hopefully running. So let's take a look. We can see we have our pod running and everything is working as expected. So this is the end of the demo for today. And to summarize, what we did is we have created a private Kubernetes cluster. Then we've created an Azure Container Registry. We configured the container registry to be only accessible from a private network. Then we added a private endpoint to the container registry and attached this endpoint to the AKS VNet. And with this setup, we were able to pull the image from the container registry over the private connection. This whole setup allows us to have all our resources inside VNet, and nothing is accessible from the outside or from the internet. This means we keep all our resources safe, but the one downside is that our DevOps pipeline doesn't have access, especially if we use a Microsoft hosted agent for our Azure DevOps. The workaround would be to have an agent running inside this VNet. And if you're interested how to do this, let me know, and I can create a video where we can set up everything with an agent, and we can do the deployments with the agents from inside this VNet. If you made it this far into the video, thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, let me know in the comments. And if not, I will see you next week with a new video.